Well, let's get started. My session this time is completely different than last week. Last week was more historical and timely. And I have a lot of different loves with my Jewish background and what I love teaching. And I love Tanakh. I love biblical texts. And my approach is I had opportunity of studying with really some superb scholars at Berkeley. I was taken under the wings of Jacob Milgram. I don't know if you've heard that name, but he really is the greatest teacher I ever had, and rabbi, as well as perhaps the most brilliant biblical scholar of our day. He died a couple of years ago, Zichrono Livracha. And I said with Jeffrey Tigay and a lot of great luminaries in Bible. So I grew to really love Tanakh. And my approach to all of these subjects, as you'll see, I hope you will come to synagogue and listen to me. But when I deal with the Torah text, I like to deal with a lot of historical background, biblical criticism, modern scholarship, along with traditional exposés and teachings of the text. So you're going to see that combination, I hope, in my presentation, which today is on Kashrut, the dietary laws, keeping kosher. So let's get started. First of all, the word kashrut, which a lot of you probably know, but just worth repeating, that the word kasher does not have anything to do with food. What does it mean? It means being fit. You can have a kosher business, which has nothing to do with food. You can have kosher witnesses, a kosher service, a kosher anything. It means to be fit, proper for doing. That's what kasher means. And food, of course, has been associated with much of it, but it has more life than just food. The Torah obviously believes that kashrut, the dietary laws, are extremely important because there is more written about kashrut in the Torah than any other mitzvah in the Torah, including Shabbat, more than any others. So there's something major about it. And that's why it's important for us, regardless of what our dietary habits are, at the least, to know where it comes from and why it's so important. I like to explain one major aspect of Jewish ritual, if you will, the mitzvot, the commandments. I've always liked to teach the mitzvot as a way of Judaism's unique way of concretizing values. That is, a lot of religions espouse peace, harmony, charity, you name it. You get if I'm at a clergy meeting, everybody agrees on the ideals. But really what makes Judaism unique is this concept of mitzvot, and that is values are one thing, but you have to live by them. You have to do them. Judaism is in sum, a behavioristic religion. We're not in the main goals, frankly, and we'll have other discussions about other religions with due respect, but the primary values of both Christianity and Islam, our Western religions, is on enunciating ideals, faith issues. And Judaism says that it's one thing to espouse a faith, but you must have a life of mitzvot. You have to live by them. And the two pillars, as far as ritual commandments, the most written about than any other of the ritual commandments in the Torah, are Shabbat and Kashrut. So it raises the question, why these two rituals? And if I were to poll you, what would eventually come out from you is that the two most important values in Judaism are peace and the sanctity of human life. Peace and the sanctity of life. Everything else is commentary. Even love your neighbor as yourself is all about contributing to the idea of peace. That's why we say Shabbat Shalom, because the purpose of Shabbat is to live, extend ourselves, to live a day of peace, stopping everything. And there's a lot of different aspects about that. And our unit is not about Shabbat today. So that's deserving of its own special unit. And the other is Kashrut, which is about the sanctity of human life, which I'm going to try to prove to you is indeed the case. Now, if you ask most people what the reason for keeping kosher is about, the answer that you'll usually get, and often from people who don't keep kosher, I love Judaism, Rabbi, but I just don't understand that kashrut, because I can understand 3,000 years ago, there were all kinds of diseases with animals and all kinds of problems with health. So because of hygienic reasons, there's no reason to keep kosher anymore. The problem with that explanation is it's not in the Torah. The Torah says nothing about hygienic reasons. There are some residual things that we have done through the centuries for health reasons and hygienic reasons, like washing the meat after the slaughter, inspecting the lungs for all kinds of diseases. That's fine, but those are derivative. They are secondary to the purpose of kashrut. The only major authority who used hygiene as a reason for keeping kosher was Maimonides, 1140 till 1205, so 12th century. Maimonides, as you know, was a physician. And the only explanation of kashrut that he used in his Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, was as a doctor. And he wrote that text really for a largely non-Jewish audience in explaining Judaism. So even Maimonides' emphasis on hygienic reasons is a little bit tainted by his brilliant background. He wrote manuscripts about medicine that are still read. But by and large, Maimonides is in a very small minority on that. Hygienic purposes is not the reason why we keep kosher. There was Philo, there's some rabbinic texts as well, who promoted the idea of we are what we eat. And Philo, the great Alexandrian Jewish diaspora philosopher from 50, his years were 50 BC to 5 CE. He said that we are what we eat. We don't eat the pig because we don't want to be like pigs. We don't eat shellfish because we don't want to be creepy, crawly things at the bottom of the water, of the ocean. We have a relationship with the animal world. But I'm going to take exception to both of those, as I'm going to now share with you what I believe are the major sources regarding keeping kosher. And I've abbreviated some of this, especially I didn't feel it was necessary to write the entire chapters out, but there are 2 whole chapters in the Torah just on the dietary laws. But the system of keeping kosher begins with the opening chapter of Breshit, of Genesis. Adam and Chava are created, Adam and Eve, the first human beings, and they're given a diet. God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that is seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food." So in other words, in the idyllic Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, the first diet given to humanity, and this is before Abraham, before Sinai, there are no Jewish people around yet. The ideal of paradise was that we were to be completely vegan. No dairy, no meat, seeds and fruit. Next layer, though, God has a change of mind, which is really interesting. After the flood of Noah, humankind devoured itself through lawlessness, which, by the way, the word for lawlessness in the Torah is Hamas. I always found that quite striking. Violence and terror. You know that God, after the flood, with Noah, makes a new covenant called, there's a rabbinic expression for it. It's called the Noahide covenant. And God makes a concession for the first time. He, in a sense, he changes his mind. And now he says, every creature that lives shall be yours to eat, as with the green grasses. I give you all these. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. So in other words, God says, you can have your meat. I'm going to make this concession to you, but you cannot eat the blood. The blood is a symbol of life. And of course, that became a very great pillar at Kashrut, and draining the blood after the slaughter of the animal. In other words, God makes a concession. Ideally, you wouldn't have any meat, but I'm going to let you have meat, but you better not eat the blood. And this is carried further in Leviticus 17. You can read the whole chapter there. It's all about the sacrifices and eating blood. And if anyone of the house of Israel or of the strangers that reside among them partakes of any blood, and this is, of course, after Sinai, I will set my face against the person who partakes of the blood, and I will cut him off from among his kin. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have assigned it to you for making expiation for your lives upon the altar. It is the blood. You see the staccato-like emphasis here on blood, life as life. That affects expiation. Therefore, I say to the that should be Israelite people. I'm sorry, there's an extra S. No person among you shall partake of blood, nor shall the stranger who resides among you partake of blood. And if any Israelite or stranger who resides among them hunts down an animal, that's the reason why hunting for sport is prohibited by Jewish law, or a bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For the life of all flesh, its blood is its life. You can see the emphasis on blood and life and blood and life and blood and life. Remember that animals are created on the sixth day, the same day as human beings. So the Torah struggles with this relationship, as you can see. Now, the most famous chapters about biblical chapters on keeping kosher are chapters 11 in Leviticus and chapter 4 in Deuteronomy, and they're essentially the same, with very few variations, some variations in the specific animals. But without the whole text here, you'll trust me on this one. The Torah outlines 4 domains of life. First the land, then the sea, and then the air. And we'll get through the specific animals. And then it concludes with the reason for keeping kosher, after all the animals are delineated. For I, the Lord, am God, your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. For I, the Lord, am he who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy. Again, repeated, you shall be holy, for I am holy. That's the only reason given in the Torah for keeping kosher. And what is holiness is really the question. We're going to get to that. But maybe we can find that out by discovering the details. I think you're all pretty well familiar what's in the Torah, what we can eat, what we don't eat. I think the first principle of the biblical laws is that you can't have everything. We see that tension even early. You can't eat everything. You can't slay everything you want. You can have land animals. They have to chew their cud. They have to have split hooves. That's it. If they have split hooves and don't chew the cud, like the pig, it is treif. You can't eat it. If they chew their cud and don't have split hooves like the horse, you can't eat it. These animals have to be domesticated. They have to be vegetarian. They have to be tame. Those are the only animals you're allowed to have. In the sea, as you know, we only eat fish that have fins and scales. Any shellfish that's scavengers at the bottom of the water is forbidden. Now remember, for most shellfish, I've been told there are some that you don't have to do this, But for lobster and crab, you have to boil those fish alive. I always wondered when I was a kid, when I would go, my parents would take us out for dinner or whatever, and we go into this restaurant and see the lobster in the tank. I thought that the restaurants were just kind of having a fish tank for everybody. But they have to do that because the only way that you can really make a lobster without poisoning someone is you have to take it in a boiling vat of water and you have to kill it alive. So we can see already why that would be prohibited based upon this limitation and the whole concept of holiness. Other factors too are brought in, like the pig, which I gave a sermon on a few weeks ago when the dietary laws were a part of the reading at Shemini. They also eat their young, which was a big factor for the rabbis. Not good, not good. You have to be holy. And shellfish, frankly, there's a whole movement of, and you can look this up, of those who believe that there's a relationship between cancer and eating shellfish. I'm not a scientist, I don't know, but there's some who do believe that, because it is true that the shellfish at the bottom of the ocean floor eat a lot of the chemicals and the stuff that filters down to the bottom and are not the healthiest of life. But that would be derivative. The reason for not eating shellfish is simply a limitation. You cannot have it. And third, air animals. You can only eat those animals that do not eat blood, are not hunting birds. They have to be domesticated. They have to be vegetarian, the quail, the duck, the goose, the chicken, etc. Turkey, which of course is not mentioned in the Torah, but was approved of by the rabbis as far back as the 17th century. So we still enjoy our Thanksgiving meals. So limitation. Now the question is, what does it mean to be holy? And here we have some interesting background. And this is not me. This is from Professor Milgram, who taught us very, very clearly in his brilliant presentations in his commentary on Leviticus. The non-Israelite world back then would only forbid people from eating animals that were sacrificed. The universal, it was a universal blood prohibition of sacrifice animals, which is the complete opposite in the Torah. A sacrifice animal in Israel was sanctified and could be eaten, and the dietary laws and prohibitions also applied to animal life outside of the sacrificial world. This was a deliberate attempt to separate Israel from the pagan culture where food became divine. In Israel, all life was divine. The Torah doesn't say how animals should be slaughtered, but there is a mention of shechita, is of course the kosher slaughtering process. Deuteronomy 12:21. If the place where the Lord has chosen to establish his name is too far from you, you may slaughter any of the cattle or sheep that the Lord gives you, as I have instructed you. The Torah doesn't say what that means. The rabbis understood that to mean that there was a way of slaughtering the animal, and you may eat to your heart's content in your settlements. So the rabbis understood this to mean that there was an appropriate way of slaughtering, which we'll get to. We know from 1 Samuel of the antiquity of the dietary laws. Saul is around the year 1050 BCE. And I'll share one other thing of proof. Saul ordered, spread out among the troops and tell them that everyone must bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter it here and then eat. Which to scholars, this meant that there was already a prescribed way of taking food. Now, it is a very interesting archaeological fact that in the land of Israel, you know what they've done with archaeology. There is a Philistine museum in Ashkelon. I think it's either Ashkelon or Ashdod. There were 5 major Philistine cities and a really magnificent museum. The Philistines, of course, was Israel's major enemy in the biblical period. And we've uncovered in there from that area thousands and thousands of pig bones, thousands of them, all over the place. In the similar period in Judea and Samaria, in the earliest settlements of the Israelites that we know, dating back to the 13th into the 12th century before the Common Era, they have not found one pig bone in the entire area, which is a phenomenal discovery and really alarming. And again, dates the antiquity of these dietary laws to the earliest of Israel's existence. So I leave that with you. The Talmud and the rabbis, of course, added to the Torah. We're rabbinic Jews. The Torah says nothing about the methodology of shechita, but based upon the biblical precedent of holiness, they instituted the practice of shechita that involved the immediate unconsciousness of the animal with a minimum of suffering, which involved the very detailed measurements of the knife. If the knife has one nick on it, it makes the animal treif and unedible. The shochet, the kosher slaughterer, is the only one who can take life. I can't do it. I'm not a trained shochet. I don't think we have one in the congregation because it's a very honorable profession. The shochet, according to the rabbis, acts as a kohen, as the priest of old at the altar in Jerusalem, whose obligation after slaughtering the cow or the chicken, the blood is drained. The shochet is trained in the piety and the manners of Jewish law. So that, as the rabbis say, so that a soul is not torpified by the incessant slaughter of animals. The sensitivity to the magnitude of the divine concession. Again, the concession is you can have meat, but boy, it is limited. Number of animals and how you take your life. That is allowing death to living things. This is the concession that God gave to us according to the Torah. The foundation of this, in my view, and I think it's indisputable, is ethical. It's not hygienic, ethical, and it involves the inviolability of life, the need to satisfy human beings' appetite is compromised. In Judaism, as Maimonides always taught about the golden way, we don't deny ourselves alcohol, but we limit our alcohol. We don't deny ourselves meat, but there's a way of our taking meat. It's this beautiful way of enjoying the pleasures of life, but remembering where we got them. Now, the concept of kadosh is very interesting. This is kind of a sidelight, but where does the word kadosh, kadosh, as I mentioned here, anyway, I don't know whether, I hope our practice is to lift ourselves from our heels when we recite the kedusha, holiness. This word kadesha is mentioned twice in the Torah regarding the practice of the Canaanites. A kadesha was a fertility cult prostitute. So in other words, in the Canaanite practices, the concept of holiness was, to the Torah, completely foreign and completely barbaric and immoral. So when the Torah emphasizes the word kadosh, what it's trying to do is completely reverse the ethics that they inherited in their environment. What is holiness? What is kedusha? Leviticus 19. It's called in biblical scholarship the H code or the holiness code. If you look at that chapter, it speaks of honoring our parents, keeping the Shabbat, leaving a corner of the field for the poor, being mindful of the wages to a laborer, do not put a stumbling block before the blind, do not insult the deaf, and on and on and on. In other words, to the rabbis, holiness meant our behavior, the idea was to, while we lift our feet during the Kedusha, is we want to imitatio Dei. We human beings try to approach a life of God, of godliness, and a refutation of the pagan concept that holiness in the ancient world, holiness was associated, the fancy word is animism. Holiness was associated with objects or with mountains and rivers of things, whereas the Torah emphasizes human behavior. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord your God. I am holy, you shall be holy. Complete refutation of the ancient world. Holiness in the Torah is approaching holiness of God, the holiness of the land of Israel, the holiness of the vocation of the Kohen. Remember, the Kohen in Israel could only officiate over life, could not come in contact with the dead, except if there was a loss of spouse, the two siblings, brother and sister, parents, mother and father, or daughter or son. The only time a Kohen, those who keep strictly, could go to the cemetery, only live. Where does that come from? Because in Egypt, a Kohen could only come in contact with the dead. The exact opposite. The Mikdash, even the name Kadosh, the sanctuary, land, person, place, Shabbat, the concept of time is holy, of Am Yisrael, Am Kadosh, a holy nation, a complete opposite of the idea of adoration of nature. Ethics is a path to God. The prophets emphasize this, built upon what the Torah already mentioned, love your neighbor. Reduction of the number of animals, the limitation of slaughter, the prohibition of the consumption of blood. Now, the question can be raised, because I want to get your questions on about all this. What's the purpose of keeping kosher? Does it really make a difference to God whether we have a shellfish or not, or we eat a treif animal? And this is one of my favorite midrashim from Midrash Tanchuma. I would guess nobody really knows, but 3rd to 5th century, something like that, which address that question. And the Midrash says, what does God care whether a person eats unclean or clean animals? Answer, the commandments were given only to refine humanity. That's a great Midrash. Kashrut's for us. It doesn't make any difference to God. It's about us and refining us. Ritual is not an end in itself. By the way, I hear from many people, and I don't want to stereotype orthodoxy, because not everybody buys it, but I hear from many when I go shopping, especially at the kosher market. I hear conversation or engage in conversation, and they'll say, I keep kosher because it's a commandment in the Torah. I don't know why, but it's a commandment in the Torah. I don't like that approach. Before we do anything, we should know what it's all about. And that's why this is very important. Kashrut's not about blind obedience. It's, as you can see, a much richer concept. Mitzvot as vehicles to a higher ethical life. Now, the famous anthropologist Mary Douglas, I don't know when she lived, I would guess in the 1940s or 50s. She did a lot of work on why certain animals were chosen in the Torah and why some were not. I just mention that because a lot of scholars have leaned on her scholarship. But what we do know is that there was, what was unique in the Torah was this limitation to domesticated animals and all the animals being vegetarian and obviously passive animals. Now, there's another thing I'd like to mention, a couple things here. The separation of meat and milk. We really didn't know much about that until recently. Al tivashel gedi b'chalev imo. You should not see the kid in its mother's milk. That verse is mentioned 3 times in the Torah. And that is a very important part of the separation of meat and milk. The reality of Egypt is that they sanctified death and restricted life. Whereas in the Torah it says, Uvacharta b'chaim, you shall choose life. And that's why the Torah makes, as the rabbis understood it, this great separation between taking life and receiving from life, the two domains, the mother and child reunion, as was made famous by a song by Paul Simon. We separate. The pig I mentioned has a long history, which is not worth getting into. Well, the Torah only says that you don't have pig because they don't chew their cud. They have split hooves. But the pig has a long history of being an adored animal in the Roman Empire and the Greek period. And we have a long history with the pig because the pig was used as a sign of conversos who forcibly converted to Christianity. If they were caught not eating pork, they could be tried and killed by the Inquisition. That's worth another whole lecture unto itself. Genesis 32:33, another thing that we didn't know about for a long time. The wrestling match between Jacob and the angel God, all kinds of interpretations there. As you know, the Torah says that we're not supposed to eat anything from the hind part of the animal. That's a hard one to understand. Why not? Well, now we do. This is where archaeology and our study of ancient cultures really comes into play, which is a favorite part of mine because I think it enhances our understanding. In the ancient world, because animal life was scarce, we know now that they used to, and this is from the Mesopotamian documents, they used to take the hind part of the animal to feed their families. The hind part of the animal, which is the muscle part of the animal could replenish that muscle. And then the hind part of the animal could be used over and over and over again before it was slaughtered. Not in the Torah. You do not inflict that kind of pain on animals. That's cruel, barbaric, and pagan. Therefore, we know now why the hind part of the animal is forbidden. Now, if you go to some very special places in Israel, they're able to take the sciatic nerve out of the animal. I've never had that in my entire life, but it's a very expensive and very difficult process. I don't know if there's anybody in the United States who can do that, but in Jerusalem there are. But generally, the hind part of the animal is completely prohibited. Hygiene, as I said, there are hygienic parts of kashrut. They're very impressive. They did help Jews be healthy during periods of great disease and problems with food. But it's a derivative part of, secondary part of kashrut and not the major reason. The Jewish home is also part of being kosher. Mikdash Ma'at. We're supposed to create, the rabbis say, a small sanctuary in our home. That's why also part of kashrut is nitilat yadayim, washing our hands before the meals. It's like approaching the altar at the temple in Jerusalem, reciting hamotzi before we break bread, birkat hamazon, the blessing after the meal, because it says in the Torah, v'alchalta v'savata uverachta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall eat, and then you shall be satisfied, and then you shall bless God. That's why our major blessing is after the meal and not before the meal. Every table's an altar. That's why we salt the challah before Shabbat, before we break bread, because we are replicating the korbanot. As Rabbi Shimon wrote, 2nd century, if 3 have eaten at a table and have not spoken words of Torah, it is as if they had eaten sacrifices to dead idols. That's the sanctity of our table. It's all part of the kashrut laws. Now, let's see what time we have. Good, we have about 8 more minutes. I'm going quickly here. I want to mention 2 stories from my own personal experience. I'm going to start with actually the second one. In 1984, I was a very young rabbi then, but I was chosen as one of 10 rabbis. It's a complicated story as to why I was chosen, to accompany Joachim Prinz. Rabbi Joachim Prinz was one of the major figures, along with Leo Beck, one of the major rabbinic figures in the 1930s in Germany. And he had not been back to Dachau, where he was imprisoned. He was finally released by a lot of world pressure in 1938. That's why his life was spared, and he was able to go to the United States, and he had a pulpit in New Jersey. He was a Reform rabbi, very Reform, by the way. But he was a terrific rabbi, individual, and I was really blessed to be in his company in his latter years. I would say he died probably sometime in the mid-90s, maybe even before then, I'm not certain. But anyway, we went with this delegation of rabbis. I was the youngest one, and we were wined and dined. It was the first official rabbinic delegation. It was then West Germany. There wasn't even a united country then. And boy, I went first class. You can't believe how they fed us, and they put slippers on us. I never had a flight like that in my life. And they showed us all over the country, and we saw every palace, every castle imaginable, and political leaders. And one night we were having dinner, and my friend Joe Horowitz, who was a dear colleague of mine, he said, "Colleagues, is it just me? But did you notice in every castle that we went to, there were scenes on the walls, paintings and wallpaper and hunting rooms all over the place, with animals flung over the shoulder with blood spewing out their mouths, and dragons and killing scenes from the 18th, 19th century?" And we all said yes, and we had been to Dachau too, so it was very difficult for us. And we all concluded that we can see there was such an adoration of the hunt, of spilling blood. This was not our culture. This was not us. It raised a lot of questions about the relationship between that, the love of the kill, and what our people lived through. The more moving story comes from another individual who I also knew in my very youngest years as rabbi, Jacob Bieber. He wrote a book which I cannot find anymore. I gave mine up, called Survivors. Jacob Bieber was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was from Ukraine. He was a young man when the Nazis came into Ukraine in 1941. And he left with his wife and little baby, as many Jews did, hiding from the Nazis in the Ukrainian forest. His parents were killed. His family left behind. He was young enough to escape. So he spent 4 years running in the Ukrainian forest. He tells his story about how he survived. Don't ask. And I remember Jacob. He was a real starker, a very healthy, vigorous man, even in his older days. So that must have had something to do with it. Nothing could interfere with Jacob Bieber's strength. Anyway, his most moving story in his book that he told is that in December of 1944, the Russian liberating forces were coming into play, and the Jews who he had combined with joined them in December. So their days of running away were over with. Now, mind you, during this period of running from the Nazis, his wife was shot, his baby was shot and killed. He was the only one that survived. He's since remarried, by the way, when he came to the States, and had a beautiful family. But he tells the story, there were 2 other Jews there that he had been hiding with in the forest. And the first night he was there, the Russians had brought in these Nazis, German soldiers, about 10 or 11 of them. They chain manacled them, and the Russians were half drunk, and they were laughing at the Jews because they were just as anti-Semitic, as the Germans were. But they took the Jews in, and they had their pistols, and they said, "Jews, we're going to give you the opportunity to to shoot these guys. I'll bet you really like getting back at them. So Jacob was given the gun. He tells the story. It's very moving. He said, I looked at the gun. I had never had a gun before in my hand. We didn't fight like that. We were running. No weapons. And he said, I sure wanted to kill all of them. They destroyed my life. But he said, and the other two felt the same way. They dropped the pistols onto the snow. Their Russians were laughing at them. They picked up the gun and mowed them down without even thinking about it. But what's interesting is Jacob said, I couldn't do it. I grew up in a Jewish home. And every Sunday morning was a real delight for us. We used to have this great breakfast with eggs and the challah left over from Shabbat. And my mother, he said, if she saw a little drop of blood in the egg, she would scream, Treif! He said, I swear our house was shaking to the bones from hearing her cry that out. It must have been some scene. And he said, that's the home I grew up in. We were taught that even the sight of a little drop of blood was not the Jewish way. And so he devoted his whole life after that, as he grew up as a religious Jew. He was a modern Jew, by the way, but he certainly kept kosher. So I'll never forget that. And I think it's very, very meaningful because it raises the question of, I'll finish with these. Hunting is sport prohibited by Jewish law. Jews have been victims of barbarisms of the hunter, tortured, maimed, and murdered. The Jewish abhorrence have all legalized violence. We have a whole legislation of Tsar Balei Chaim, of being mindful of the treatment of animals. It's a beautiful part of our law. And is there historical validation? The answer to that we Jews shouldn't be ashamed of, it is a fact that homicide rates and crime rates of spilling blood among Jews is much lower than virtually every other segment, even today. Violence. I also want to mention, even in Israel, no matter what all those naysayers are trying to say about us, I can tell you firsthand from my own family, these soldiers have a very strict Jewish concept of Tohar HaNeshek, even in fighting these horrible and terrible wars for defending the country. They're always mindful of the purity, Tohar HaNeshek, and the way that they, sadly, what did Golda Meir say? Peace will come when the Arabs value the life of their own children more than killing us, something to that effect. That's a very, very important part and still is valid. Why the ritual? I share some ideas here. We live in a very violent world, and unfortunately, unless you have a different view, I think you're getting a little more violent in society today. We're losing the idea that freedom, which is what Kashrut is all about, is about responsibility to a high degree. Jews don't require non-Jews to keep kosher, but we accept this great responsibility to teach the world that we can curb our nature. Ideals are abstractions, but the mitzvot are not just for lip service. We have to live by them. Ritual is a discipline, and in our tradition, it shapes character. The blood prohibition, which we discuss with Noah in Genesis, precedes the Ten Commandments. And to the rabbis, that was important because that blood prohibition even applies to the non-Jewish world, whereas the Shabbat was given to Israel. So you could make a case that the dietary laws apply to the non-Jewish world to some degree, not the details, but certainly the blood prohibition. I just mentioned this, you might have others. Video games, music, the culture of today have become increasingly sanctions for violence. Perhaps we should really understand, as I believe Kashrut has done, has taught the world the power to alter the history and the values of humanity, because the inviolability of all human life is still such a necessary goal, and we've moved so far away from that. So God willing, we'll live in a world in which our beautiful Jewish values will become the values of not only our people, but God willing, the rest of the world. That's my presentation, everyone. I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very, very much. I can see by the applause on the screen here that the audience is very appreciative of all of your efforts on this very informative and interesting topic. I don't see any questions on the chat right now. So I am going to scroll through. Let me just see if I can.
I'm going to stop my sharing here so I can.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
See if anybody has any, just raise your hand or take off your sunglasses, Mara. You know, if anybody has, just if anybody has any questions. A fantastic job is okay.
Hey, Susan,
that was not a question.
I know, my dear Susan. I gotta see Susan here. We're old friends, dating way back. Where is Susan? I'm looking.
She's on the second screen.
There you are. I see you now.
She's waving. Do you want to identify her for the masses here?
Susan and I met, I think about 1986. 86. That long ago. And we met, became friends, and then she met her husband, Neil, and I had the honor of marrying them. I went to Roanoke or to Lynchburg for that?
You went to Lynchburg.
It was Lynchburg. You got married in the synagogue there. Yeah.
I did.
Right. And then we were close, and, life, I went this direction and you went that direction, but we always kind of stayed in touch. And now, look, we're living in the same city. So
wonderful.
World.
Yeah. And we're going to hit a lot of baseball games.
Okay.
A lot of yeah.
We have a couple of questions. So we have Joel Fetter first. Dr. Joel, do you want to speak up? Unmute yourself, and you are unmuted.
Rabbi Altshuler, do you remember Rabbi Dov Rosenblum from Skokie Valley Synagogue?
Did you ever know him? I know Skokie Valley Synagogue because my Uncle Sam and then my Aunt Sue were members there for many, many years. Is that where you're from?
What was their last name?
Altshuler. Altshuler.
Anyway, Rabbi Rosenblum would occasionally officiate, but he was really the educational director. But he was trained in trabering. So he'd go down to the slaughterhouse before Rosh Hashanah, and we get some special cuts of meat.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Don't expect that from me. I never slaughtered an animal in my life. I like going to the supermarket for that. Trader Joe's, I understand, has plenty of kosher chicken.
That's the easy way.
That's the easy way. I like the easy way.
It's wonderful to learn from you, and I look forward to seeing you in person.
Thank you. Are you from Skokie? Are you from that area?
Yes, my father's.
Hey, Susan Schlossberg, AAA Travel. Hey, disregard that. Happy Thursday. Disregard that email. That's a program.
And I was on the board for about 30 years.
My Uncle Sam of Zichrono Livracha, blessed memory, he went every Shabbat morning, and he had knee surgery. This is really funny about my Uncle Sam. He was a great, brilliant guy. Wonderful. And we became very close because when I was in Chicago, he was a regular at my shul there. And he had knee surgery. He was a volleyball referee on the side. He hurt his knee doing that. And he never missed a high holiday service in his life, but his doctor said, you can, because he used to walk to shul. His doctor said, though, Sam, you can't walk to shul. So he went to see the rabbi before Rosh Hashanah. His wife took him. He was on crutches. And he said, Rabbi, do you give me permission to drive to shul this Rosh Hashanah? And the rabbi said, Sam, better for you to stay home than come to shul. And I never recovered from that. Started going to a conservative synagogue instead of the Orthodox one.
We have a question from
the original rabbi there, Rabbi Milton Cantor, when that question was posed to him, can I drive to shul? He said, if you're in the car on Shabbat, I'd rather you wound up in our shul than in the mall.
Well, that's a better answer than Sam was told to stay home. Maybe it was a different rabbi. I don't know what, there was changes in rabbi, because Skokie Valley was a pretty, Orthodox synagogue. It was liberal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a breakaway from B'nai
if I
Amunah.
remember.
Yeah. And it was everything except the men and women sat together.
That's right. Yeah.
I would like to get to a question from Mr.
Okay,
Zapp.
Harry.
So, sir, could you please unmute yourself and
Yep. Rabbi, I have a question I'm confounded with. I don't understand why fish is parv and chicken is fleshik. I understand that the animals that are mammals are fleshik, but I don't understand how they decided chickens were and fish weren't.
Well, you raise a very good question, because there were rabbis in the 2nd century who felt that chicken should not be part of the prohibition of eating meat and milk. Now, chicken was a kosher animal because it's an air animal, it's poultry. But you're right, their question was, it doesn't breastfeed its young. So the question is whether the prohibition of eating meat and milk applied to fowl. And Rabbi Yossi of the Galilee said, you know what? I'm going to have, chicken Kiev, milk and chicken together. I don't know. I forgot what food that is. But he was in the minority. And eventually the rabbi saw, because of the slaughtering process, that chicken, turkey, duck, goose should be included in the category of separating for meat, and because they're slaughtered, of separating meat and milk. But you're right, it was debated. And then the question was with fish. Fish are not slaughtered. Fish are either, and usually netted. In the old days, they used to net fish. So there was no slaughtering process. So the rabbis decided, well, it's not exactly dairy, because it's not dairy, but it's not meat because there's no slaughtering process. So the rabbis, in their great wisdom, which is really nice for us today, declared that fish was then parv. You could have fish with meat, and you could have fish with dairy. What would our lox and bagels be without cream cheese? So the rabbis did us a tremendous favor in making fish parv. And you know what? I like that. I think that was a wise thing to do. So that's been our tradition. We could debate them. I suppose there are many who feel so very strongly about being vegetarian, and that's fine. It's completely kosher if you decide you can't eat any life, any fish at all. But that's why our rabbis, the rabbinic law, decided that fish was part. There was another major question about eggs. Eggs. Are they dairy because they are products of the chicken? Or are they meat because they have the potential for life? So the rabbi said, well, it's neither one. So we're going to make eggs parv too. So you can have eggs with salami. You can then, if you have a dairy meat, you can have eggs with all your cream cheese and bagels. And that's the way rabbinic law developed. But they did debate these issues. They were discussed. So you raise very important fine tuning of the system here. The most difficult 2 parts of kashrut, which are I really want to deal with the bigger parts of kashrut, but 2 really interesting issues are kosher wines and kosher cheeses. Why do we have, let's see, what's the question here? I was told that for the Seder, the fish should be served before me. Is this something? I don't know where, I'd never heard that custom, but that's a custom. It's not required because you can serve fish after meat, with meat, before meat. But why is there kosher wine? Someone just asked me the other day, why, Rabbi, do we have kosher wine? And there's really no reason for it anymore. In the Middle Ages, when the rabbis made these distinctions, wine used to have to be made by human hands. And the wines were that in the Middle Ages made by Christians were used for religious purposes, for libations, just like in the pagan period. So the rabbis decided that wines for Jewish purposes should be made by Jews for Jews. The problem with that is now wine is made for secular reasons. People drink wine from all over the world. And that today, as I understand it, from the grapes and the fermentation, they're never touched by human hands anymore. That's why in the conservative movement, we have ruled that while it's good to support kosher wine because it's supervised and prepared for Jewish purposes, great. But that domesticated and now even foreign wines for secular purposes are perfectly fine. My practice has been, and it's just in my custom, is that when it comes to Friday night, Shabbat, I like to have a kosher wine, especially from Israel. I like it enhances my contact. It's prepared in the land of Israel, from the Galilee or wherever the wine is from, and I feel good about that. But if you decide you like a particular domesticated one, that's fine too. There's no real kashrut reason for it anymore. Now, the other thing with cheese is interesting. You know, the conservative movement has also allowed us to eat non-kosher cheese, and that's based upon the rennet that is made from the kosher animal to make the cheese. And the question is whether that rennet comes from an animal that is slaughtered by shechita or not. A kosher cheese is made from the rennet of the animal that is prepared for a kosher slaughter. But the conservative rabbis have ruled a long time ago that the rennet from a kosher animal, even if it's not slaughtered under the laws of shechita, is perfectly fine because the rennet changes its chemistry. It's very complicated, but that's the reasoning behind it. But then here I have my quirks too. Here I know the rationale for eating so-called non-kosher cheese, which is cheese by definition. But yet when it comes to Passover, I only buy kosher cheese. Don't ask me why. It's just been like my habit, and I like supporting the industry at that particular time of the year. So to each their own. You're perfectly fine either way that you go with that.
We'll get to a couple quick questions, Rabbi, from Randy Wynn. The mention of lifeblood, rather than referring to the actual blood, could it also mean that the animal should not be eaten alive? Could you comment on that?
No, the animal has to be slaughtered. No animals can be eaten alive. And now fish, sushi, which is the delicacy of the Hasidic community, is perfectly fine. It's not cooked. But a kosher animal has to be slaughtered appropriately. The flesh cannot be eaten raw at all. And so therefore, that by definition would be treif. Animal has to be slaughtered and the blood has to be drained. I remember when I was a kid, my grandmothers and my mother used to take me to the kosher butcher. They used to sell her the meat for us. And then my mother had to come home, my grandmother to help, and they had to drain the blood with the kosher salt. I don't know if you remember doing that. But now when we go to the butchers in LA or anywhere, they kosher the meat before we buy it. And so I remember that was a long, kind of a strange process with draining the blood and koshering the meat. There's a long, elaborate process from the slaughter of the animal, the inspection of the lungs, glot kosher. Glot refers to smooth lungs. That's another whole issue. And the washing, the rinsing of the animal carcass and whatnot, which is all part of the hygienic secondary measures related to kashrut. But anyway, it's interesting how all that developed as well. But the principle is, and you can't get all the blood out of the meat, but the idea is to be reminded of that. And when an animal is slaughtered, the blood is drained and buried in the earth by the shochet, and the blessing is recited for that. That's the Jewish way. And that's to remind us that in theory, if we could, we wouldn't have one drop of blood, even from the kosher slaughtered animal.
I think I remember, weren't those kosher salt, wasn't that in the big red box, as I recall? Does that ring a
Remember
bell to
those?
anybody?
Yeah, the kosher salt boxes. That's right.
Yeah,
And they
big
were
red box.
huge. That's right, with huge grains of salt to really pour inside the meat and drain that process.
I can't remember what I had for breakfast.
Forging of the meat, but we don't have to do that anymore, thankfully.
I can't remember what I had for breakfast, but I remember that. Last question from Ben Berman. If kashrut has such important ethical implications, why is it one of the most prominent Jewish practices abandoned by Reform Judaism? I don't know if you care to comment on that.
Well, that's a really good question. Now, Reform Judaism really banned kashrut in the 19th century in classical Reform communities in Germany. It was seen as, of course, they didn't have the knowledge that we have today of kashrut. But frankly, to be honest, the classical Reform movement in Germany wanted to get Jews out of their separation. Their chief ethic was to break down all these barriers. They did a lot of other things, like take the talit away, the kippah away, Hebrew away, references to the land of Israel, from the prayer book away, all kinds of things. Now, it is true that there is more of an awareness of kashrut. I can't say that all Reform rabbis, but many of the Reform rabbis I have met do keep kosher now, at least to some degree. And I know there's many Reform rabbis that have tried to make their congregations more aware of kashrut because they're greater students of kashrut, of the types of things that I've shared with you. So there are more Reform Jews. I can't say many, especially rabbis who are more mindful of the commandments. Reform Judaism has changed a lot in that regard and made it more traditional than it certainly was in the early years of Reform Judaism. That's a fascinating subject. And many have said that's one of the chief dividing points between the conservative movement and Reform movement, and that our sages, our movement, never discarded Jewish law. Our scholars and rabbis understood that Jewish law, as I've presented you, is at the heart of who we are as Jews. However, we're mindful of changes. I think that, for example, abuses in the kashrut industry have been very alarming. We have a movement, I forgot what we've called it, but we have a group of conservative rabbis that monitors to make sure that these kosher slaughtering places are keeping the ethical standards of kashrut. And also there are other issues. For example, the hoisting of animals, and we've questioned, how our animals are raised. All those are legitimate questions within the rubric, within the framework of the dietary laws, and those are important questions to raise. It should be an evolving system of growth. And if we remember that the principle of it is the inviolability and sanctity of life, that certainly can help us understand the kinds of conversations we should have about kashrut.
Well, again, Rabbi, thank you for this very, very enlightening.
I hope you enjoyed.
Oh, I'm certainly, we very much did. And I think that this presentation only solidifies the general sentiment of the audience that we are very, very much looking forward to your arrival in 34 days. And you can kind of get the picture from that. So before we close the meeting, our president, Dr. Eric Ferber, would like to say a few words. And with that, I turn the program over to Dr. Ferber.
Thank you, Marshall. Good evening, Rabbi Altshuler.
Good to see you.
Good to see you in London there.
I'll be there soon.
Yes, we look forward to this. On behalf of everybody here today, I'd like to thank you for a really wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I think an alternative title might have been Everything You Wanted to Know About Kashrut and More, because you've really covered every single aspect. It's really very, very comprehensive. You've set the bar very high, and we look forward to future presentations. I'm sure we'll have many of them. So we thank you.
Thank
We
you.
wish, on behalf of all of us here, we wish you and Ella all the best and safe
We'll be seeing
travels.
you soon.
Safe
Yes.
travels.
We're all
and
excited. We're all excited. And
Stay
I want to
safe.
tell you, Eric, that my synagogue here, my Sunday morning class, they bought the two of us a full subscription to the concert series at Sarasota as a thank you gift. So
Oh, wow.
we have lots of
Wonderful.
concerts to go to.
We look forward to seeing you at those concerts. So
We will
that
go
is-
to, we'll make it together. We're gonna
we'll make it.
celebrate.
That'll be marvelous. So on behalf of all of us here,
Thank
we
you.
wish you safe travels, and we look forward to seeing you very soon.
I will be there with you. I'm
And
looking
once again,
forward-
folks, take a few minutes to Google Rabbi Altshuler, especially his wife. Light up a Lucky, pop open a Schlitz, put your feet up, and you're going to read stories that'll just amaze you.
She
So with
is-
that, I say
My wife
goodbye.
my wife is much more interesting than I am. She's
No,
incredible.
they're pretty good stories there on the internet. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you,
you soon.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Safe travels.
Thank you. We'll be there soon. We're coming. We're coming.
Can't wait.
Can't wait.
I can't wait to be there with you.